So I'm going to share something with you today that I wish someone had told me years ago, because there's a lie that gets passed around in our field from therapist to therapist, supervisor to supervisor, and it's quietly keeping some of the most capable, mission-driven clinicians stuck, in starting a nonprofit therapy practice. So in this hour, we're going to be able to walk through that, and you'll be able to see it clearly, the process and why this works. And once you kind of see it, you can't unsee it type of thing. So let's start with actually what's happening right now in our field, not in theory, but in real life. And just a reminder, if you have questions, go ahead and pop them in the chat as we go throughout this, and I'm going to answer them at the end. But every month that goes by without a sustainable structure, another clinician ends up hitting a wall. They end up reducing their caseload, leaving the field, or they just stop caring as much as they used to because the system of the mental health field was never built to sustain it. I've definitely been there myself. I saw an uptick of this in COVID of people not going into grad school to become a therapist and tons of therapists leaving the field because it just didn't feel sustainable. And then the communities that we want to serve, they end up going without access. And not because there aren't enough skilled clinicians, but because the systems that the therapists work in don't allow them to show up in a way that they want to, right? To serve those communities. And so that ends up being the cost of staying stuck. So it's not personal, it's just this outward ripple effect that I've seen happen across our field. And so, if you're honest with yourself, you probably have felt this way in your own work prior, and you might now. I know that I have lots of different times throughout my career. And so, you might be carrying a full caseload. You're juggling sliding scale clients, insurance panels. Maybe you're taking Medicaid, Medicare. You're adjusting your schedule every quarter, trying to make the numbers work, right? And crunch them. And at the end of the month, you're still wondering, is there a way to do this work without burning myself into the ground? That question to me is not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of intelligence because the answer is yes, but it requires something that most of us were never given. I'm just letting some people in. And so here's the thing that nobody talks about out loud. Our grad programs taught us, for the most part, how to hold space for other people. It taught you assessment, diagnosis, treatment planning, ethics, boundaries, right? It taught us all of that stuff, gave us the foundation for it. But it never taught us how to build a structure that holds space for you. Not financially, definitely didn't teach us operations, and not in a way that sustains us long term, right? And that gap between your clinical skill and your structural knowledge is where most therapists find themselves stuck, not because they're incapable, but because they were never given that information. So I want to tell you what changed for me because it wasn't what I expected. I used to think that I just needed to work harder, see more clients, say yes to more things, and push through like the exhaustion that I felt in community mental health. And for a long time, I did. I thought that's just the way it was, and I needed to suck it up, basically. But nothing ended up fundamentally changing for me. What finally shifted wasn't the actual effort that I was putting in, it was my understanding of the structure. And the more I worked in community and mental health, the more I started to understand that structure and what the gaps were between community mental health and full-on private practice. So once I kind of saw that that problem wasn't me, and it was actually the model that I was operating inside of, everything opened up for me. And that's exactly what I want to walk you through and show you today. So I know I saw some questions of wondering where I'm at, what I'm located. So let me introduce myself if you haven't met me. Some of you might know me from the Facebook groups, or my Facebook group. I'm Dr. Lauren Lawson. I'm a licensed therapist in Pennsylvania and California. And I started my nonprofit in California in 2013. We still operate in California, and now we also operate in Pennsylvania. So, throughout my journey, I've learned that a lot of therapists don't know that this is an option and how you can structure your practice. So, I want to say maybe about 5 years ago, I started to specialize in helping clinicians build their nonprofit practices, in a legally sound, financially sustainable, and a way that was aligned with your values, right? So throughout this, I've guided over probably 50 therapists at this point, in varying different states, through the process, from like the very first conversation about whether this is even possible to actually having a legally compliant, fully operational nonprofit. And I support probably over 1,000 clinicians in my Facebook group. Some of you may have joined that from the webinar, or the workshop, but they're navigating this in different stages. They might be at like, oh, do I want to do this? To, oh yeah, I have a nonprofit and I'm using this Facebook group as like a resource support. So I'll pop that in the chat just in case some of you haven't gotten that Facebook group, but it has tons of free resources and trainings in it. So what I'm sharing with you today isn't theory. It's not something that I just read about. It's what I've actually built myself, continue to run, and what I've helped other therapists build that's actually working in the real world that blends like the best of both worlds from community mental health of serving vulnerable communities and the best of private practice and blending that into a therapist-led nonprofit. So I'm going to walk you through that today so that it feels clearer and you get a better understanding of what that looks like. So the foundation, this is the foundation of everything that we're going to go over, and that is structure. The problem is not effort. The problem is absolutely structure. Most therapists I work with are not lacking in effort. They're definitely not lazy and they're not uncommitted. To be honest, they're some of the hardest working professionals I know. And to me, that's actually part of the problem because when effort alone isn't producing the results that you want, the natural instinct for us as therapists is to push harder. But when you're pushing harder inside of a broken structure, that just accelerates the burnout. And I think that's a big reason why we saw a lot of us burn out, not just before COVID, but especially during COVID, right? And afterwards. We kind of said, oh, enough is enough. Like, this is not reasonable for us. Second, I'm going to walk you through the real difference between doing meaningful clinical work, which you're probably already doing, and building something that actually sustains the clinical work. Because those are two very different things. You can be an exceptional clinician and still be operating inside a model that's slowly draining you. So even if you're doing that clinical work, if it's draining you, you're not going to be able to continue doing that. So until you can see the distinction, it's almost impossible to know which part of that system do we change, right? And the third is that, and this is the part that changes a lot for clinicians when I explain it. We're going to go through and bust some four specific myths about nonprofits that keep therapists either stuck or prevent them from starting their nonprofit. And these beliefs get passed around in our field as if they're facts, but they're not facts. And once you see them, you'll be able to understand exactly why you felt stuck and what the actual path forward looks like. So stay with me. And I'm keeping a track of the questions coming through. So I'll absolutely talk about some of the questions coming in as we go through the workshop. And again, I'll answer questions at the end, but stick with me. We're going to get to the meat of everything in a minute. So before we go any further, I want to name something really important. And what I'm about to share with you is not recycled business advice. It's not generic entrepreneurship framework that someone like slapped a therapy label on. I think right now you probably all have seen this with social media and clinicians being on social media, which is totally fine. I'm on social media. But we've seen like this oversaturation with like business coaches on how to start a private practice, right? Which is great. If that's what you want to do, I am all for that. We all have our own path in this field, but this model is not that. It is very specific to the nonprofit world, and it's not something generic. And it's not a model that requires you to sacrifice your income or your control, which is a myth we'll bust, or really your integrity to make it work. So you've probably seen people offer things like that, and you're probably, at least I've been burned out on like the advice that didn't really match up with my values, right? That didn't really match up with like serving the people that couldn't access care. So I want you to hold me to that as we go through this workshop and presentation. So here's what I want you to get out of this in the next hour. What most therapists spend piecing together through years of trial and error, expensive consultations, and conflicting Google searches is going to make sense by the end of this. I'm not going to oversimplify it, but I'm going to lay it out clearly and honestly in a way that respects what you all want to do in this field. I feel like you deserve to have all of the information presented in a way that makes sense, even if it's not necessarily, uh, you know, not a lot of effort because it is, and I won't lie to you about that. So we'll go through like what are the realities of starting a nonprofit. What I want to do first, though, is let me know as we go through this which one of these characters applies to you the most. And we're going to talk about why these matter as we go throughout the workshop. But let me know if you recognize yourself in one of these three scenarios. Some of you already know which one you are, some of you might not be sure, but you'll definitely know by the end. So the first one is Marcus. Marcus represents a therapist working in an agency or community mental health setting. You're doing incredible work, meaningful work. You're doing crisis intervention. You're serving underserved populations. You're taking on the cases that nobody else wants. But the system inside that you're working in is limiting your impact. You're underpaid, you're overworked, and you're starting to wonder if there's a way to build something sustainable on your own terms without losing that mission that drives you. This was me. I was definitely a Marcus. I never even went into private practice. I was always a Marcus. And that's what drove me to figure out, is there another way to do this? The second one is Jennifer. This is the one that I see a lot come to me. The Jennifers are already in private practice. She's doing sliding scale. She's taking Medicaid. She's serving people that she cares about. But she's slowly realizing that she's essentially already running an accidental nonprofit. She fits the criteria of a nonprofit, but doesn't know that. So she's doing all of the work of like a mission-driven organization without any of the structure or benefits behind a nonprofit, like the tax benefits, the support, and accessing additional funding streams. So the whole thing ends up depending entirely on her. And so if she stops, the practice stops. So let me know if you're a Jennifer. The third one is Rachel. So Rachel's financially successful. She has a thriving practice, right? From the outside, everything looks great, but something on the inside feels misaligned. She knows she has the skills, she has the resources, she has the expertise to serve populations, but they can't currently access her level of care because the way she was taught to structure private practice and to be financially sustainable is to set these rates that people who don't have access to those rates will then not get that treatment, right? So I get a lot of people, a lot of Rachels that come to me who have very successful private practices, and they have these amazing trainings like EMDR, IFS, ones that are really, really expensive. And to be able to offset that cost, their rates have to be a certain amount, right? But then they feel like something missing in their heart because they can't serve these people who can't access their services. And sometimes people find themselves, between a Jennifer and a Rachel or between a Marcus and a Jennifer. So drop in the chat which one resonates with you. Are you a Marcus, Jennifer, or Rachel joining this? And if you're someone else entirely that represents the community, let me know. But these are the three that I find that come to me the most. And it's usually the Jennifers that are realizing they're actually already running a nonprofit practice. So I see some people saying mostly fit with Marcus. Marcus, yeah. Yeah, I was definitely a Marcus. That was me for sure. So let me kind of go through. I see Jennifer coming in. A lot of Marcuses this training. Usually I have Jennifers. Oh, adjunct teaching. I see that. Yeah. Yeah, that's a lot. A lot of Jennifers and a lot of Marcuses have other income that's supplemental, right? Doing other things to kind of offset doing that mission-driven work, which can also lead us to burnout too. And also, though, it are things we're passionate about, right? Like two things can be true at the same time. Um, yeah, I see more Jennifers coming in. Not a lot of Rachels in our group. That's okay. Sometimes, it's a mix. There's so many of us across the country where we're in different spots. But let me talk about who this is for, because this is going to speak to all of you that identified as a Marcus or Jennifer or Rachel. This training and workshop is for you if you're doing meaningful work impactful clinical work already, like you're in practice of that, but it doesn't feel structurally sustainable. And you can feel it in your body. Something about the way it's set up, it doesn't feel like it's gonna hold. And this is also for you if you feel burned out inside a system that limits your impact. So whether that's an agency, a solo practice that depends entirely on you, or a group practice model that you're in that doesn't really align with your values, that feels like, oh, this is just about the money that we're churning out, right? Because a lot of people that I've talked to in a group practice can feel that way. And I don't think that's the owner's fault at all. I think that's the reality of the system that we live in. So, how do we change that structure, right? But there's a common thread in all of this that the structure is working against you, not for you. And this is also for you if you want real lasting impact, but you refuse to sacrifice your income, your control, or your integrity to get it. I fully believe in what all of the saturation we see on social media that therapists deserve to get paid what it takes to do this work. I absolutely am on board with that. But I don't think we need to sacrifice our income to serve populations that can't access care. I believe that we can do both things at the same time. So I'm going to show you today how you do that in this field. And I really feel like it's important to go over who this is not for because I just want to be super clear about that. This is not for you if you're looking for a shortcut that skips the legal and ethical foundations. The legal and ethical foundations are the foundation of everything that I do. So I'm not going to help you cut corners, and I'm not going to pretend that compliance in a nonprofit doesn't matter. So if you want someone to just tell you to file the paperwork and like figure it out, that's not going to be me. I'm going to walk you through like the pros and cons so that you can make an informed decision for what feels right for you. And if that's not starting a nonprofit, then I'm never going to push you to do that because I don't feel like it's for everybody. Um, so I'm also not going to tell you that it's necessarily easy. Building a nonprofit is meaningful and it's very rewarding work, but it does take real effort, real compliance, and real commitment. So I won't ever minimize that and tell you like, oh yeah, you're going to X your income in 3 months, all of those things that we see out there on social media about, um, you know, um, 3Xing your income. That's just not the path that this is about. What I do want to do is make the path clear, ethical, and achievable. I fully believe it's achievable, even if it's not totally easy all the time. So there's a big difference between it being easy and it being doable with the right support. So, and this is all stuff I wish someone had told me when I started my nonprofit. I was totally in the dark when I started my nonprofit. I figured out everything on my own. I had some great supports along the way, but I was definitely lost in it for a long time before I started to understand how it all made sense. So here's what I hear from therapists more than almost anything else. I'm tired of feeling like the only way to be sustainable is to compromise what I care about. So what ends up happening is you raise your rates so high that the people who need you the most can't afford you. You take on a caseload that slowly destroys your health. You work inside a system that treats you like a billing unit, right? How many times, if you're a Marcus, have you heard productivity requirements? Um, so it starts to feel like sustainability and your values are in direct competition, and that's exhausting. Um, so what you actually want and what I'm going to show you exists is a model that serving your community and sustaining yourself are not in competition. They don't have to be in competition. So impact and stability, they actually coexist by design, not by accident. So that's the key here is that we're designing this on purpose. It's not a fantasy. It's all about the structure. And most therapists just simply have not been shown how that structure works. So what you're going to walk away with by the end of this is you'll know with clarity whether the thing that's been keeping you stuck is either an effort problem or a structure problem. And I can tell you right now, for most therapists, it is definitely not effort. It's never been effort. It is mostly structure. So I'm going to walk you through what needs your attention first, because what happens is that overwhelm usually comes from trying to do everything at once. And so I do have something at the end of the training I'm going to give you that helps with this and will make your next steps clearer. I'll drop it in the chat. It's just like a free download. And it's like usually the first thing that I give therapists when they're thinking about starting this journey. So stay with me. So I'm going to take you back for a minute because like I've said, I've been in this exact place. I was building something that I deeply believed in, working with populations I cared about a lot, doing clinical work that really mattered to me. And the whole time, I always felt like, can I really do this long term? Like, how do people actually do this long term? This is when I was really focusing on high risk youth, suicidal, cutting risky behaviors, sex trafficking with youth. Like, it was really hard to stay in that. And I was like, how can this actually be sustainable for clinicians? How do we not get resentful of the field? I started to ask, am I doing this right? Is there something that's missing within me? Um, or something that I'm doing wrong that's going to come back and bite me in the ass later, right? And so the uncertainty is really heavy in that. And that's what kind of kept me for so long of like actually moving forward with my nonprofit in the beginning. I had it built, but I didn't actually execute it for 2 years because I was stuck in this uncertainty of it. And so the uncertainty is what I see most in a lot of the therapists that I talk to about this. And every therapist has a different story. We have different backgrounds, different practice settings, different financial situations, but underneath it all, the strain ends up being the same. It's the feeling of doing this meaningful work inside a structure that doesn't support it and wondering, can we actually do this long term? Is there a better way? But like not knowing where to start, feeling like there is, but we can't quite put our finger on it, right? Um, so we end up doing what all of us probably have done in our careers. We adjust our fees, we rework our schedule. You say yes to another client because you need the income, or because you can't say no to someone in need, right? I know that's been really hard for me for sure. You try a new insurance panel, you get off insurance panels, you restructure your sliding scale, you've tried it all, and still nothing feels like it's meeting that need, and it still feels like your income and your mission driven work are in competition. So you're constantly like stuck in this circle, but nothing else is changing. So let me know if you've ever felt that way, if you know what I'm talking about, like that deep feeling of like, oh, can I do this? How do I do this? Um, because let me know if I'm not alone in that. I have felt that for so many years in my career. Um, but this is the part that actually really gets people. You're never quite sure if the problem is you or the system. You think maybe I'm not business savvy enough. Maybe I should be able to figure this out. Maybe other therapists have cracked the code and I'm just missing something, right? That self-doubt is so real and we all have felt it at some point. But I truly believe this is not a reflection of your capability of a therapist. It's a reflection of gap in information that you were given about our options to provide services in this field. So that's really when it hit me. The problem was never my commitment. It definitely was never my work ethic. Um, and I know it wasn't my clinical skill, right? Like I could retain the clients, they were coming to me. We always had referrals coming in. The problem was the structure of it all. And so I was trying to build something sustainable inside a model that wasn't designed for sustainability. And once I saw that, I really had this shift of like not blaming myself and started looking at the structure. And that's what I want to give you today is how to do this structurally. So here's what I want you to know. This isn't just my story. It's nearly every therapist I work with, what they run into, different details, same pattern. And when I dig deeper with them, we get past the surface level frustration and we get into like what's actually holding them back. And what I've realized is that what's holding people back is four specific beliefs that you were taught or absorbed or assumed were true. And those beliefs keep you stuck or keep you in this space of uncertainty from actually forming a nonprofit therapy practice. So let's get into them and talk about what those four myths are that are keeping you stuck. And I call them myths because they are widely believed. They feel true, but they are not true. And every one of these I've seen get repeated in our field by supervisors, by colleagues, by well-meaning professionals, finance experts, and they just simply don't know, so they keep repeating it. Um, but all of these myths have a clear factual answer, so I want to walk you through them one by one so that you understand. And then after the myths, I do have some frequently asked questions that I get all the time, and I want to answer some of those questions up front because they are almost every clinician I talk to asks me the same questions. So, myth number one is this is a really big one. This isn't legal, or at least it's not legal for someone like me, like a therapist. This myth stops more therapists than any other because they assume there's some rule they don't know about, some licensing board restriction, or some conflict of interest that makes it impossible to start a nonprofit therapy practice. So they end up never even looking into it because they've already decided that door is closed. I actually came across this recently. I saw a couple people on here from California. California is a big one, right? Like this is a very interesting problem that I run into with this myth all the time. This was about 2 months ago. And I was helping a therapist start a nonprofit in California, and I was helping her register for Medi-Cal. Now in California, it didn't used to be this way, but now in California, you have to register through something called PAVE to be able to get onto Medi-Cal. And PAVE had directly told this therapist that LMFTs are not allowed to start nonprofits per the BBS regulations. And I was like beyond floored when I saw this because I was like, that's 100% false. And I was so upset by this misinformation by this huge system, DCFS, that this was happening. And so I ended up calling CAMF. And for those of you that don't know, CAMF is the California Association for Marriage and Family Therapists, and they offer free legal advice by a lawyer if you're a part of their membership. So I called the CAMF lawyer and I was like, hey, PAVE is telling therapists in California that they're not allowed to start a nonprofit per the BBS regulations. And I said, correct me if I'm wrong, but from my understanding, even to have a traineeship or a practicum, you have to work under a nonprofit model. You can't work in a for-profit. So how can LMFTs not be allowed to form a nonprofit? And CAMF was like, wow, I cannot believe that PAVE is still giving out this information. They had said to me they've actually been battling with PAVE for 7 years. In giving out misinformation about the BBS regulations. So CAMF and the BBS have been working together to kind of dismantle this myth, complete false myth that PAVE was putting out there to clinicians. So many clinicians were like, oh, well, okay, I guess I can't do this, so I'm not going to do it just because PAVE told them that and they trusted PAVE. Meanwhile, the BBS is saying they're totally interpreting our regulations. And in fact, CAMP put out a letter, I believe, in 2018, encouraging therapists in California to start therapy nonprofit practices because of the benefits that it has with the community. So, my point in all this to say is that this is absolutely a myth and that nonprofits can legally operate alongside private practices. You're allowed to start them as a therapist. Your licensing board has zero issue with this model. It's not a gray area. It's not a loophole. It's an established clear structure that's used by thousands of therapists across the country. We just don't talk about it, right? So people doing this don't talk about it. It's not a widely known thing. So the reason you think it's not legal is because no one ever told you that it was, or you got wrong information by people that you trust that you think are giving you accurate information and they're not. And then sometimes when our brains don't have the information, we fill in that gap with fear. And that's normal, but it's just not an accurate thing. So know that it is absolutely legal. And I have not come across a state yet where this is not legal in. Myth number two, nonprofits can't generate real revenue. And if I go this route, I'm basically going to be taking a pay cut. This one is deeply ingrained in us, right? Most people hear nonprofit and they immediately think, oh, that means no money. So they picture underfunded organizations running on donations and hope, and they think that they can't afford to do this, right? So, most of us, we have student loans, we have bills. And we really, once we get to like licensure status, we can't afford to take a financial step backward. But here's the truth. Nonprofit is actually a tax classification Nonprofit does not mean no profit. It's not a financial statement. And a well-structured nonprofit actually generates revenue through the way private practices do. Client fees, insurance reimbursement. They have additional funding streams that are available to them that's not available in private practice. So grants, donations, sometimes certain contracts require you to be a nonprofit. And in many cases, a strategically designed nonprofit can generate more sustainable revenue than a solo private practice or a group practice because it has access to those funding streams that private practices don't. And because they don't have corporate income tax, right? So they're tax exempt in that way. So you end up saving a lot of money that can go back to your salaries and your mission. So you're not actually taking a pay cut. You're restructuring your tax classification for long-term financial sustainability. So those two things are very, very different, and it's important to know that difference. The third myth is that you can't pay yourself well and that you definitely can't pay your staff well. Or I've heard this one too, that you can't get paid at all, that you have to be a volunteer. So this one is really hard when I hear this myth because it really does keep good clinicians trapped in systems that undervalue them. And I think, well, they think that nonprofit means accepting low pay for themselves and for anyone else who works for them. And that honestly directly contradicts why they want to do this in the first place, right? But the truth is, you can absolutely pay yourself well, and you can pay your team market rate salaries or even higher than market rate salaries in a nonprofit. The reason why community mental health can't do this is because they have so much hierarchy. They end up being a jack of all trades and master at none. And so you end up having tons and tons of programs in community mental health under this one nonprofit umbrella. And the more programs you have, the more contracts you have, the more overhead you have. And so that ends up taking money away from the people providing the services directly. What I'm talking about is more of a micro level nonprofit practice where you're building in competitive compensation from day one. It's not an afterthought into building a nonprofit. The compensation is built into the model itself. And the myth comes from these underfunded organizations. And a lot of those organizations are nonprofits that were never designed well. It's probably from people who wanted to start a nonprofit, but they didn't really know what they were doing. And so they think that they need to be funded solely on grants and donations, which is not the case at all. Grants and donations are supplemental funding. Your foundational funding is the same as community mental health. It's the same as private practice. That does not change. So when you build it right, fair compensation is part of that plan. And I'll give you a real example for me. I work 3 days in my nonprofit right now, right? I've been building this for 13 years. I've started it in California. We're now in Pennsylvania. I see about 10 clients a week at this point. I provide clinical supervision, and I have a salary of 123,000 for 3 days a week. The other 3 days, I'm doing this business, which is completely separate than my nonprofit. And then my clinicians in the nonprofit, in my current area, I'm in Coatesville, Pennsylvania. They make $10 more an hour than the local community mental health agencies. So it is possible to do this and pay your clinicians well because you're not going to have the same level as overhead that a community mental health agency has, and you're not taxed in the way that a for-profit practice is. When you think about it, a for-profit practice, right, you're probably setting aside 30% of your total revenue for taxes. In a nonprofit, you're tax exempt. That 30% goes back into the organization for you to put towards salaries or client scholarships or building new programs. You don't have to worry about that 30%. That's a really big chunk that you're leaving on the table. So let's dive into myth number four. This is the one that honestly keeps the Jennifers and the Rachels, mostly the Rachels, up at night. And it's if I build a nonprofit, I have to hand over control to a board. Someone else will be making decisions about my vision. So if you've spent years building something, right, it's your practice, it's your reputation, your clinical approach. The idea of giving that up to some board feels absolutely terrifying, and I completely get that. Here's the truth though. You are designing the board. You get to choose the members. You can have founders writes on your bylaws, you set the governance structure, and the board is really there to exist for compliance and strategic oversight. It's not to override your leadership, and a board definitely is not usually involved in operations. Operations is for clinical directors, director of ops, CEOs. They're the ones who are carrying out the operations, not a board. So a well-designed board makes your organization stronger, not weaker. And you still get to maintain control over your clinical vision, the programs that you want to set forth, and how you serve your community. So your vision stays protected. And that's not like a hope that this happens. That's how we build it. We build that into your bylaws so that you feel protected. So, as I mentioned, I want to go through and answer some questions that came up in the last workshop that I did. These were questions that I got from therapists across the country, and I want to make sure that I'm pretty clear on some of these answers for you all. The first question is, can I run a for-profit practice and a nonprofit practice at the same time? And the answer is absolutely yes. This is one of the most common structures that I build for therapists. They don't want to give up their for-profit, but they also want to start a nonprofit. And what you need to know is that they are two completely separate legal entities. They have separate missions, separate finances, separate governance. Your private practice would keep running exactly how it is now, and maybe that's serving full fee clients, like operating under whatever current model you have. And then your nonprofit exists alongside your private practice, but it's expanding reach to the populations that you want to serve, but that you couldn't access through your private practice model. So the key is, and this is where compliance really lives, is keeping them cleanly separate. Separate bank accounts, no commingling of funds. That's really important. And no crossover of resources without proper documentation and board oversight. So, can you have a crossover of resources? Absolutely. But you have to make sure that it's written and that it's documented, and that, like, if you're donating funds from the for profit to the nonprofit, that is all well documented. So, you just need to make sure that you have the right forms in place and the right documentation in place to be able to structure that. But a lot of clinicians, especially the Rachels, prefer this because they've already built something sustainable that's working for them, but they still want to give access to people who don't have access in their current model. The second question that I got a lot is, can I transition my existing for-profit practice into a nonprofit practice? And what are exactly the benefits of that transition? So, yes, you absolutely can transition your for-profit practice into a nonprofit. There are really two different paths that you can take to do this. The first path is a full transition. This is for those Jennifers that have been already operating as a nonprofit. They plan to keep their model that way in their private practice. So they really want to take advantage of the benefits of being an actual nonprofit. This is where you would file with the IRS the full application, the 1023 application. It asks directly on that application, are you transitioning or converting a for-profit into a nonprofit? And they ask you a bunch of questions about that. And then you have to provide, I think, like 3 years of finances, and then of course have like the other things that you need for that application. I've done this for quite a handful of therapists because they've realized, oh, I already accept Medicaid, I already accept commercial insurance, we already do sliding scale. Like, why am I not a nonprofit? So they've wanted to fully transition over. The second path that you can take with this is what a lot of therapists do pretty successfully, and that's to form a new separate nonprofit and gradually transition your mission, your programs, and your services into that structure over time. So for people who don't want to just like make that jump right away or make that decision right away, you can start your nonprofit. It would have a different name, but maybe slowly transition things under to the nonprofit that makes sense, and over a couple of years, end up dissolving the for-profit. It's totally up to you, whichever way you want to do it, or if you want to keep your for-profit practice. It's really a personal decision. Um, so I had someone last year, this was someone who actually identified more of a Rachel, totally successful private practice. I think they were bringing in close to $1 million in revenue. And she was like, I really, really want to give more access, and I've made the decision that I want to transition this into a full nonprofit practice. And so she wanted to do path one, like transition everything at the same time. So I did the long form 1023 IRS application for her. She sent me all of her previous financials. We went through them. It was actually much easier than you think it is. And we just report that to the IRS, and we got it approved. I want to say within 3 months, she had it approved. And now she's doing fundraising. So I was just talking to her last week about building a fundraising campaign. So if you're interested in looking them up, they're called Hope for the Journey, and they are in Texas. But the benefits of making the transition are pretty significant. You can apply for grants, donations, which can be huge supplemental funding streams that private practice can't access. I actually just applied for a $5,000 grant today that we're most likely going to get because it's a local grant, which is something that I teach is how to go after local grants. And so that $5,000 is actually going to go towards giving all of the clinicians in my PA office access to training that we wouldn't otherwise be able to afford to pay for. So the training that we're focusing on this year is LGBTQ affirming training that not a lot of therapists in our area specialize in. So, and it's something that we do in our nonprofit. And I want to make sure that my clinicians have the most up-to-date training. And rather than paying for it out of pocket, we're going to get a grant that's able to pay for that. The other major benefit is tax exemption. And that's what I was talking about earlier of like, as a nonprofit, you are not taxed on corporate income. You still have to pay payroll taxes, but payroll taxes are significantly less than corporate income tax. When you're talking about payroll taxes, it's usually around 10 to 15% versus that 30% that you have to set aside. So your revenue between these becomes much more diversified in a way that a for-profit practice cannot do just because of the tax classification. But in order to do this, it does require clear and compliant roadmap so that you understand both sides of what you're working with. I'm going to keep us moving because I realize I'm talking a lot and it's already 12:45. Third question, I get this a ton, is can I start a nonprofit as a pre-licensed clinician? Hands down, absolutely yes. I started my nonprofit when I was a pre-licensed clinician. I had other licensed clinicians working under the nonprofit, and I actually chose to get my hours towards licensure somewhere else in community mental health, but I always ran the nonprofit on the side. So legally starting a nonprofit and working towards your clinical hours are two separate things. The IRS doesn't care about that. They don't require that you are a licensed clinician. Anyone can start a nonprofit for any mission. What does matter is if you're going to provide clinical services under the nonprofit yourself, you just need to make sure that you have an approved clinical supervisor that meets the regulations of your state board that can provide you that clinical supervision while you're obtaining the hours as a pre-licensed clinician. So it's really important to know that, and also really important to know that you don't just have to start direct therapy services under a nonprofit model. I have lots of clinicians that want to expand to providing parenting workshops, to providing peer support programs, to providing case management services, to providing retreats for community members that wouldn't be able to afford it. So it's not just that clinical services have to go under the nonprofit umbrella. It is separate than your license. And because it's not tied to you personally, the liability isn't the same as if you were to do these programs under a for-profit practice. So you don't even have to be doing clinical services under a nonprofit if you're a pre-licensed clinician. You can, but you just have to make sure it's structured the right way and that you're setting it up that meets the licensing requirements of your board. So I want you to sit with this for a minute. If it's legal, and it is, and if it's financially viable, and it is, and if you can pay yourself well, which you can, and you can maintain control of your vision, which you absolutely do, then what is actually stopping you from starting a nonprofit? And I feel like I know what it is. It's not you. It's not the lack of skill or ambition or commitment. It's the fact that nobody ever told you this information. No one told you that you can do this ethically and in an achievable way that makes sense for your specific situation. So I feel like it's really important that clinicians know this as an option so you can decide what makes sense for you. So a lot of times, the only thing standing between you and a legally compliant, financially sustainable nonprofit is the structure that you were never given, right? It's not a personality trait, doesn't mean you need a business degree. It's not more hustle. It's just a structure, clear, ethical, step-by-step structure designed specifically for therapists, and that's it. We just need to create the structure in order to do this. Um, so you're not disqualified from doing this work. You never were. You were just given incomplete information. And in the absence of information, you make the most reasonable assumption. Um, and that is that it's too complicated, that you're going to get it wrong, that the assumption was, and that assumption is totally understandable. And I see some comments coming in. I'll definitely address some of them at the end. But to me, you already have the clinical skill, you already have the ethical grounding. Most of you already have your mission. So you just need to figure out the structure to match that. So, we're gonna keep going here because I want to make sure we get to the end and I can give you some of the resources that'll help you along the way. But it doesn't have to take years of trial and error. Um, you don't have to figure this out alone. There is a faster, clearer, more supported way to do this. Um, so for the first time, you're probably seeing, yeah, I'm seeing the questions come in. I've heard people it's taking 6 to 12 months in California to come. No, that is so false. So I'll walk you through that in a second about California. Um, and I'm gonna actually get to how fast it can be. Um, so what is different about this is that this is built by someone who lives in your world, me, right? I am a therapist. I am also a nonprofit leadership coach. I have certificates in nonprofit leadership, probably about seven, and I have a certificate in organizational psychology. So I know the best of both worlds in running this. And I find that what happens often is that people get generic advice from lawyers or CPAs that don't understand our world. So the question is, what do you want to do about this? You've seen the myths, you know they're not true, you understand the problem has been structural, it's not personal. You know that a clear path exists. And the question isn't whether this is possible anymore. The question is, do you want to do this? Do you want to start a nonprofit? What does that mean to you? So you can keep piecing things together on your own. Googling how to start a nonprofit at midnight, definitely been there multiple times. Asking a lawyer that doesn't quite understand the therapist part of it, asking a CPA who also doesn't quite understand the therapist part of it. And a lot of times you'll get five different answers and still not knowing which one is right. So you can keep doing that. And honestly, some people do. That's totally fine if you want to take it slow. Um, but I'll tell you what I've seen. The path, typically doing it on your own takes 9 to 12 months because you're piecing this together and it ends up costing you more than you expect. And you end up leaving wondering if you've missed something critical. But it doesn't actually have to take, as I see in the comments, 6 to 12 months or 9 to 12 months. There's definitely a different path where you can do this. And that is totally up to you. There's no pressure. You get to decide if you want to do that or not. So I'm going to walk you through my done for you package. This is built specifically for therapists. So you don't have to guess, Google, or hope your way into doing it right. Every step of this is legally sound. Every document that you get is
Yeah.
ethically grounded, and every piece of it is built to protect your vision and your license. It's yours. So once you get it, you get to do what you want with it because it's your nonprofit. I'm just here to make sure the structure underneath it is solid and it's ethical and it gives you a foundation. So it's designed to take you exactly where you are right now of I think I want to do this, but I don't know how, all the way to actually a functional nonprofit. And so the simplest way I can say it is like you bring the vision and I build the structure for you. I do every filing, every document, every compliance step. All of that is handled. You don't have to become an expert in nonprofit law. You don't have to learn the IRS language, and you don't have to spend months of researching what you don't know. That's my job. That's what I do to make sure that it is set up correctly for you, and I take care of the rest. Um, So I want to be clear, this is not another course. It's not a library of videos that you have to watch, take notes, and then try and figure out how to implement. This is implementation. So this is me actually implementing it for you and with you so that you know exactly what to do. And it's done within 2 weeks. So just to address the question that I saw come in, how long does it take to convert a for-profit to a nonprofit? I've heard people say it takes 6 to 12 months in California. The filing paperwork part, that is something that gets done in 2 weeks. The IRS approval depends on where the IRS is at. It totally depends on the administration. Sometimes it can take up to 6 months, but lately, currently, right now, it is taking about 3 weeks. So it really depends on if it depends on the government. I mean, that's something that's out of my control. But the clients that I've been working with since really changed over the summer. Since the summer, it's been taking 2 to 3 weeks to get that IRS approval for people specifically transitioning. For people just starting a new nonprofit, it's much faster. Sometimes it's less than 3 weeks. So it's a different process that the IRS does. So, this package is built for therapists and mental health professionals who want to expand their impact beyond their current limits and their current structure. So, whether that's an agency, a solo practice, or a group practice, um, or it doesn't align with your mission anymore, right? It's for therapists who know somewhere deep down that they're called to launch a nonprofit, that you're thinking about it, maybe for months, maybe for years, but the process feels overwhelming, that you haven't had anyone show you a clear path that makes sense for someone with your background. Um, and you're exhausted by conflicting advice from different people. So this is for you if you have experienced that in the last couple of years. Um, and this is also like if you just want a clear path to approval, you already know your mission, you already know how to execute it, and you're like, I just need someone to do those initial steps that I don't know how to do. That's what this is. Um, so I'm going to actually kind of skip ahead here and go directly into the package so I can make sure I get to these questions. So here's what you actually get. You get articles of incorporation and your bylaws. These are custom drafted for your state and your specific clinical model. It's not a template. It's not something generic. The documents are built for your practice. You get the 501(c)(3) application prepared for you. And it's specifically designed for therapist-led nonprofits. I have 100% approval rate. Like I said, I've done over 50 of these. I've never had a denial, whereas the general public, if you look up the statistics, it's about 50% get their application sent back. You get a board member selection guides, and the board guide also tells you how to run a board. It breaks down the language that might be nuanced in running boards, like the jargony stuff of it. And then you got a 5-year business plan with financial projections because a nonprofit without a revenue model is not sustainable. So you get the financial roadmap. It's not just something legally compliant, but it's something that will help you financially sustain itself from day one. You also get policies, procedures, and a comprehensive SOP. This is a really big belief of mine. I'm not going to sit here and talk about structure and then not build you an SOP because operations behind the scenes are everything to keep it running sustainably without you burning out. So to me, that's what separates a nonprofit that's technically legal from one that's fully operational. Um, and then also with this package, you get two 45-minute strategy sessions with me personally. These are one-on-one coaching sessions that help you refine your mission. We actually talk about how to implement any fundraising strategies, go after a grant application to implement the finances of it. I teach you like the 101 that was never taught to me that I quite frankly had to learn on my own being in executive leadership and community mental health. So everything is tailored to your practice. And so the result of this is a clinically compliant structure that works in the real world, just not on paper. So, as I mentioned, all of this is done within 2 weeks. A lot of that is dependent on your timeline, actually. I get it done within 2 weeks, but if you, want to space it out longer, that's completely up to you. But I get this done so that we have the paperwork done by the first strategy session. And then within 2 to 3 weeks, like the nonprofit is actually approved by the IRS and you can start operating. Again, that depends on the IRS timeline, but that's what I'm seeing right now with my clients. I just filed uh, two applications about 3 weeks ago, and they already got their approval letters back. So as 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 it changes in real time, I always update people. I'm like, yeah, just so you know, it might be taking 4 months now, because again, that's outside of my control. But I like to keep people informed of the actual timeline of it. Okay, so I'm gonna skip some of this stuff because I want to just get to um, the meat of this and give you the freebies and get to these questions. Okay. Those are some people that have actually done this with me. These are real nonprofits. Feel free to Google any of these. They have their tax exempt status, and that is public information. But if anyone wants to know more about the ones that I've built, you can email me and ask me. So the nonprofit quick start package is $9.97. I offer a three payment plan, which comes out to three something. That's honestly less than what most therapists spend on a single legal consultation. That ends up giving them more questions and answers. So what you're getting here is not a consultation. This is again actually implementation. So I'm gonna put here in the chat a couple of things. I'm going to put this resource, whether you decide to do this or not, that I feel like everybody should have. It's the five most expensive mistakes that you can make when launching a nonprofit practice. So give me a second to pull up this. It's just a direct download, so you can download that. And then I am giving a promotion right now for this. So if you decide to enroll within the next 5 days, so by Tuesday, you can receive 2 months of group coaching with me at no additional cost. So that ends up being about $550. So what I do for people is after I build, they're done for you. They have the option of joining my group coaching. We do two group coaching calls a week. It's other people who are in the program that I've done this with, and we actually walk through their business plan and do things together. So right now I have someone in California. He's been with me about 2 years now, getting his nonprofit up and running. And he's in the process of applying to PAVE, like I was talking about in the beginning, and then applying to Medi-Cal to be able to take that Medi-Cal in San Francisco County. And so there's a number of steps that he has to walk through that he's not familiar in how to do that. So we do that on the coaching calls together. Another woman I have in Texas, she is transitioning her Alma and Headway clients to under her nonprofit. And we just set up her payroll system, which I use Gusto. And so on those coaching calls, we walk through actually how to do that stuff. Because again, I've been doing that with my nonprofit for about 13 years. And I've applied to probably every Medicaid, Medi-Cal there is in the states that I'm in. And so I'm very, very familiar with these processes. So there's such value in the group coaching. And so if you decide that you want to take a look at this, here's the QR code that you can check out. If you use this specific code, that's how it gets you the 2 months of group coaching. And I'm also going to put the link in the chat. And then I have one other free resource for you all if you're not part of my Facebook group. If you join my Facebook group and you go under the guide section, I have tons of free training. So if you're like, I don't know about this, I need to think about it, or I want to learn more about this, that group is for you because that's where I actually break down all these questions that I see in the chat too. But let me go and look at some of these so I can make sure I answer them. And again, the replay will be emailed out with these question and answers as well. So Tina said also the administrative load that could be significantly higher. I'm not sure if you're talking about for the nonprofit or for profit, but the administrative stuff really depends on how many contracts and services you have under the nonprofit or for-profit practice. For me, I try to keep administrative load as minimal as possible. And I'm also a really big believer in bringing in administrative tasks in-house. I know it's a big thing now to outsource billing, to outsource credentialing. I personally do not recommend any of that. I think it costs an arm and a leg, and you have to end up doing more work, and you're not actually getting what you pay for it. So I do it all myself. And billing for me, once you know the system, I bill Medi-Cal, Medicaid, most commercial insurances, I spend an hour doing billing every week. And then I spend maybe another hour reconciling the EOBs. And I can tell you from working in community mental health, where we outsourced so much of our billing and had to go through denials, I spent way more time working on denials that could have been preventable mistakes versus bringing it in-house. Um, so I think it depends on what you mean by the administrative load. Oh, nonprofit, especially hiring and managing employees. Honestly, managing and hiring employees, that's going to be the same whether you're in a for-profit or nonprofit. For me, it's about bringing on people that are aligned with my values and right fit. I mean, through community mental health and my own practice, I've probably done dozens and dozens of interviews. And if I get a vibe in the first interview, then I'm not hiring them. You have to go with your gut on this, and sometimes it just takes a lot of practice. The other thing, this is where the SOP comes into play, is you have to have a strong training and onboarding process. It absolutely makes it so much more worth it when you do the training right up front. And I build a training plan into the done for you practice package because it's a non-negotiable. It has to be there. So I'm going to get to when I researched the option for a for-profit and nonprofit, I was told it was very difficult to do in California due to needing to create a separate nonprofit entity and then need to transfer the assets of the nonprofit that buys a group practice. Can you speak to this? Yes. So part of this is correct. You do need to start a separate entity. That is actually extremely simple. I have a call at 3 o'clock that I'm doing this with someone in California today after this. And we're going to get it done in that hour because actually starting a separate entity is very, very easy. It doesn't matter what state you're in, it's very easy. California, I know like the back of my hand. You go on a biz file for nonprofit, pick the name, make sure the name's available, not trademarked, boom, it's done. Then you get an EIN, which takes about 5 minutes to apply for. In terms of transferring the assets, this is where it's up to you. You get to decide, okay, does the nonprofit buy the assets? Is the for-profit donating the assets? So it kind of depends on how you want to go about that. I did this with someone in Michigan last year, and her for-profit was fully transitioning into a nonprofit, and the board had decided that they were going to do a split. Half the assets were donated, in which case you just need to document that in a memorandum of understanding. And then the nonprofit was going to reimburse whatever was the other assets that were not actually donated. The nonprofit was going to reimburse that over a financial plan of, I forget what it was, might have been like a year and a half or something. But that was what her board came up with. You don't have to do it that way. But you don't actually, it doesn't actually take time to do that. You just have to have it documented. Um, how long does it take in California? Same kind of question. I heard it takes 6 to 12 months in California right now. It absolutely doesn't. California and most states, once you apply for a nonprofit entity, the turnaround time is 48 hours. So that's how long it takes for the state to approve. Once the state approves, then we file with the IRS. And again, the IRS applications right now are taking about 3 weeks, sometimes a little bit less, sometimes a little bit more. That depends on the government, depends on if there's a government shutdown. When there was the government shutdown, what was that in the fall? They were taking about 3 months to approve. But here's the thing, if you're approved by the state, but you're waiting on the IRS approval, you are allowed to operate. You don't need to hold operations. And I've never seen a state deny an approval for a nonprofit as long as the paperwork is filled out correctly. And I've never seen a state take longer than 48 hours. They're very, very fast at the state level. What are the pros and cons of creating a nonprofit in a more favorable tax state and registering California as a foreign entity? It doesn't matter in terms of which state you actually register in and what you do in terms of a foreign entity. Our main hub is in California because that's where I was when I started it, and we're a foreign entity in PA. I think it probably does depend on the local state tax that you might have to still pay as a nonprofit, but I know in California, you can apply for tax exemption once you have that IRS letter. I think it's like I want to say the 35A form under the state Secretary of State. Um, I could be mistaken on those letters, but I want to say that's what it is. But it ultimately doesn't matter. To me, what actually matters in terms of like which state you apply to is the clinical restrictions. So let me give you an example. In New York, New York State is very, very tricky. You can apply to be a nonprofit therapy practice, but you can't take Medicaid in New York as a therapist-led nonprofit unless you are licensed by the state for mental health outpatient services, which is a whole rigmarole that you have to go through to actually get licensed by the state. And many clinicians don't want to do that, and I completely understand. I don't mean your personal state licensing board, I mean as a community mental health clinic licensure. So what's easier is to in New York, if you decide you're okay with not taking Medicaid and you don't want to get licensed by the state, is to file somewhere else, like California actually, as a primary and file as a foreign entity with you have to do it through like the Department of Education in New York. It's just kind of a wacky process, but so there's some states like that where it does benefit you to actually file in California if you're licensed in California. Because honestly, California is very, very easy to manage as a nonprofit. PA is very, very easy. I think the most complicated states that I've come across are Florida and New York. All the other ones are very, very similar. Let me see here if there's some other questions. I think I saw one. Okay, so the different type of structures available. So the different structures that are available are essentially a for-profit practice, right? And the way you register as a for-profit is dependent on the state. So as like in California, you have to file as an S corp. You can't be an LLC, whereas in other states, it's very, very common to be an LLC. Um, so you can register as a for-profit, you can register as a nonprofit. Those are the two main structures that you can do. California, they also call it like a professional corporation, but essentially it's distinguished between a nonprofit and a for-profit. There is also something called a nonprofit business league, but if you're providing therapy services, you wouldn't do a nonprofit business league. That's more like if you're doing some sort of like membership type services. So it's really about the tax classification. And then a lot of the operations are essentially the same under both types of practices. Of course, there's some nuances, like you own a for-profit, you don't own a nonprofit. It's run by the board. You can be on the board, you can be the CEO, you can be the founder, but you don't own it, whereas for-profit, you own it. So it really comes down to a personal choice if this is something that you want to do with those different structures and how you want to set it up. Okay, so the difference between this is a great question between community mental health and the main type of nonprofit I'm talking about. They are similar. Here's the difference, though, is that community mental health, they are agencies, right? A lot of times, those are agencies that are not ran by therapists. The CEOs, the CFOs, they're not therapists. The therapists are on the ground actually providing the services, and these nonprofits are pretty concerned about going after multiple contracts, multiple RFPs, multiple federal grants that have tons and tons of reporting. And that's what I was saying earlier in the training of like in community mental health, there's this all this hierarchy. And when you have all that hierarchy, you have more overhead, less money can go to your therapist. The leadership becomes removed from the services that are happening. And I'm not saying that these community mental health agencies aren't doing great services. They are, but they have so much hierarchy, so much overhead, and they become a jack of all trades and master at none. And I have experienced that. I have worked my way up from a case manager to executive leadership in community mental health for an international nonprofit. And it really is a jack of all trades, master at none. And then the people that work for you don't get the care and deserving pay for the work that they're doing because it has to go to overhead or paying these higher salaries. And those nonprofits often are bringing in millions and millions of revenue. Um, Annually, whereas what I'm talking about is on the more micro level, a private practice level. So even if you're still bringing in $2 million revenue in a nonprofit, that's still considered micro level. Like community mental health brings in multi-million dollars in revenue. A lot of people just don't realize that because the money goes to cover losses, cover all these things. To financially stay afloat. What I'm talking about is combining like the microness of private practice in your specific community with the nonprofit model. And I personally teach not going into community mental health and doing a jack of all trades, going after any single contract that appeals to you, because then what happens is you do need more administrative work, you do need higher overhead, you do need more leadership, and that to me that truly does take away from not only the culture of the practice, but it also just creates this distance between leadership and the people providing the services. And so for me, for my practice, this is just my values, is like I only want to do outpatient mental health. At some point, well, maybe I work on another program that complements that, sure. But for me, outpatient mental health, I can grow and I can bring in $1 million business with outpatient mental health, but we're mastering that. I am mastering that service. That's what's important to me in the community. Whereas another nonprofit might focus on case management and I can partner with them, but I don't want to do all of that because I've been there. I've had to manage, 25 financial lines of service, over 100 staff and supervise 12 managers directly. It was hard. It is hard to do that. It is hard to not get burned out and to not work 24/7. So when you do it on a micro level, to me, you can have a bigger impact, keep the culture really strong in your organization, not as have as much overhead, and still deliver really good quality services to the community. So to me, that's like the main difference between a nonprofit micro level practice that's structured as a nonprofit versus community mental health. Um, okay, I don't see any other questions. Thank you so much for hanging in there with me and going over time. I need to like stop talking so much sometimes, but if anyone has any questions, I'm gonna put my email in the chat. You can email me if you want to. And just remember that promotion is good for the next 5 days. You'll get some emails about it, but if you have any questions about starting this, I'm an open book, so feel free to ask me anything, and the replay will be emailed out about 2 hours after we're done here. So with that, I hope everyone has a great weekend, and we'll talk soon.